Steve Baker, former Brexit Minister and former Conservative MP, of course. Good morning to you.
It's great to be here.
Always good to see you. Always good to see you. Lots and lots to talk about. Let's get down to it. Emmanuel Macron has blamed the UK for the migrant crisis. He said, look, we could possibly do this one in, one out deal, but basically you're going to have to make Britain not the elder... I'm paraphrasing. You're going to have to make it, Britain not the El Dorado. You're going to have to deal with welfare payments to asylum seekers and also the people being able to work on the black market. I mean, you and I have had our run-ins with the French over the last few years, and Brexit is regrettable, he said. But he's right, isn't he?
Yeah, he is right. He's not wrong about everything, but they're two they're two centrist dads getting together with a range of shared problems, like not being able to control debts because of recalcitrant parliaments. But he's not wrong about this. But it is interesting that Keir Starmer needs Emmanuel Macron to come over and tell him that we need to tighten up, because of course the Labour Party was one of the factors which made it extremely difficult for the Conservatives in government to do sensible things.
Challenged on every single thing.
Every single thing,
But one of the things I find fascinating is even the Starmer looking at, and he's desperate to get this over the line, the official sort of political summit. We've got all the niceties with the heads of state, with the King and the President yesterday and today, the big state banquet and the like, and the obvious legal requirement to have Elton John there, but weirdly, not David Beckham. Always one of those two. But he wants to get this over the line. But this idea of a one in, one out, so people who arrive illegally, I mean, they're still calling them, was it irregular migrants? No, they're already criminal, they're illegally entering the country. But by shipping them back to France and not allowing them to stay and claim asylum, and saying, well, we'll take people who are trying to claim through a legitimate route from France, that's an acceptance of what people like me have been saying for years, which is that these people are illegal economic migrants, not legitimate asylum seekers. The premise on which these people get all these benefits and the free hotel and everything is all based on the fact they're legitimate asylum seekers until proven otherwise. But if you'd agree that you'd send them back to where they came from, by definition, the government is accepting they're not. So they don't even philosophically make sense in their own argument.
I think that's a very good point, and I should love to see some lawyers argue about that in court. It'd be a good test.
Highly paid, yeah.
Well, yeah, but of course we clearly can't have people absconding and going around the UK and us not knowing where they are once they land in the UK.
Well, that's exactly what happens.
So I can see why they end up in migrant hotels. But one thing's absolutely for sure, we've got to put a stop to it. And the way to put a stop to it was not to have a merry-go-round with France. Yeah. It was to ship them off to Rwanda. And, of course, Labour opposed that and put a stop to it. I mean, a merry-go-round, one in, one out with France. I think you're right. I think you're probably right that there's a philosophical inconsistency, but I think that your listeners just want an end to put to this illegal
People
migration.
have had enough of it. How much of the failures of the Conservative government, now you've left, but you were always, should we say, a critical friend, even when you were in government. Yeah. How much of this is something that the Tories failed to deal with because there was a lack of will, and how much of it was that you were scuppered every time by the courts, or because could have changed the law, could have got out of the ECHR, could have got rid of a load of asylum tribunal judges who were just saying, oh, of course you're a paedophile, but absolutely you should be allowed to stay because you've got kids here, or oh, I'm so sorry you don't like Albanian chicken nuggets, you can stay. These are the absurd cases, but they are very, very large numbers of them. Yeah. How much of it was a lack of will in the last Tory government?
Well, I don't think it can be said it's just a lack of will. I mean, politics is hard, unfortunately, and governing is complicated. So, for example, leaving the ECHR would have massive political ramifications in Northern Ireland, because Sinn Féin would use it to advance an argument, a false argument, about there being a threat to people's rights in Northern Ireland, and on it would go to try and advance a united Ireland. So it's a complicated problem to untangle. But on a number of fronts, we should have had a much stronger resolve to proceed. Things like dealing with the debt and overspending, and yes, dealing with migrants. But to say that it's a lack of will, which I've heard done from other political parties, it's not really fair. The truth is that getting members of Parliament who have their own misgivings and their own agendas to just get in the lobby, well, they won't, as Labour's just found, members of Parliament won't just do what they're told. They've got their own pressures.
You never did.
Well, I did when I was a minister. When I was a minister, I played by the rules. Yeah. I adjusted my techniques to the roles and the problems that I faced. But yeah, certainly backbench MPs can have minds of their own. Will have minds of their own.
Very interesting. What did you make? I mean, you were a leading Brexiteer. You played an instrumental role in a number of different sort of movements by MPs to force action election, whether it was Brexit, whether it was on tackling lockdown, and for which, by the way, I'm eternally, I know my audience, eternally grateful. I don't think people often don't realise quite how much happens behind the scenes that makes this stuff happen. And I know the role you played. President Macron, in our own home of democracy, in the House of Commons yesterday, said that Brexit was regrettable.
Well, of course he did. He was bound
But isn't that outrageous to say a democratic vote by another country's people was regrettable? Who does he think he is? The President of France?
Well, exactly, yeah. No, I think he was always going to say that. But I think the real thing here is the subtext. Why is he here? It was as a reward to Keir Starmer for rolling over on fish and rolling over on hosting the European Political Council and so forth. And the truth is, Keir Starmer's really dancing to France's tune, particularly on fisheries. You know, the whole trade and cooperation agreement is written so that if we withdraw from fisheries, it pulls down all of the economic cooperation, which means the barrier to doing it is extremely high.
So
and people have missed this, so we won't. So this is a problem then, because Keir Starmer's quite likely to lose the next election. So we'll either have Nigel Farage or we'll have Kemi Badenoch as Prime Minister pulling us out of fisheries, and they'll then run into this problem. So I'm afraid the French have managed to get Keir Starmer, if I'm allowed to say this, by the short and curlies.
We've said a lot worse on this show. I mean, again, he's the worst negotiator in Britain. I'm completely convinced if he did do an asylum seal, we'd end up paying Mauritius a few billion quid. Just an extra few billion from Mauritius. Here you go, just out of the goodness of our hearts.
He doesn't even want to do the things that we would want done. So, of course, he's a terrible negotiator.
He can't get very much done. We know that. We know the state of the public finances. He's got the budget coming up in the autumn from a tearful Rachel Reeves. I mean, she might have been crying last week. We'll all be crying in the autumn. But it's really interesting. The latest polling YouGov found, this is extraordinary, 13% approval of this administration's performance. So we're talking about a huge number of people who voted Labour, who long-standing Labour voters who think the government is doing a bad job. Now, interestingly, some of that would be because they're too left-wing and they're throwing money at train drivers or giving in on welfare reform. Others would be sort of, how dare you even think about doing welfare reform? But the reality is, the numbers don't add up. They haven't for some time, but they definitely don't now. We are heading in some dangerous territory. Yesterday, we had a report by the OBR. We only mentioned it very briefly on the show yesterday, but I know you've been tweeting about it, posting on social media about it. It was caveated in the way that the Office of Budget Responsibility writes their reports, and you could easily look at it and go, oh, that's all fine. But basically, it was saying, we are in a whole heap of trouble.
Yes, and they're always very careful not to say anything that could be used politically. But in 2018, they were very clear that what this meant, it was unsustainable, that very large levels of debt, like 270-odd% of GDP, would not happen because policy would have to change. But when they say policy would have to change, what do they mean? They mean defaulting on age-related spending, and I tried to get them to
explain that in English.
It means not paying the pensions that people are expecting.
And the triple lock, which Labour and the Tories
It's worse than that, because if you look at the triple lock, in the long run, the triple lock only makes a marginal difference. The truth is that unfunded state and public sector pension liabilities are multiples of the national debt. You get up to 4 or 5 times the national debt when you include pension liabilities. And this is the...
the pension outlay, just in the actual outlay every year is well over £100 billion a year.
It is extraordinary.
It's the biggest chunk of our welfare payments.
So look, this is so serious, because the awful truth is, people will say, your listeners may be screaming at the radio saying, I paid in. And it's true, they did pay in through their national insurance. The problem we all face is that money was spent at the time on someone else's pension.
A lot of people, and I think people they weren't outrageously lied to, but they were led to believe they're paying into, especially with national insurance, they're paying into a pot, and that money is going to be there. And if that's not, that money went into it's a tax.
That's right. There is something called the National Insurance Fund, but it's basically quite a relatively small slush fund through which money washes. But look, since we've talked about France, a very famous French philosopher called Bastiat said the state is the great fiction by which everyone seeks to live at the expense of everyone else. And what is happening, I'm afraid, after 100 years of the welfare state, is that the problem is crystallising that we can't afford, and we're not going to be able to afford, the age-related spending promises, because
we're an ageing population. People are living longer, which is a success of the health service, and then the health service costs more, and then people. But here's the thing: the pension age is going up very, very slowly. I would say not fast enough, and there maybe have to be differences in terms of someone doing manual labour or someone like me just sits behind a desk and can work for longer. But the reality is, most people in this country will not have paid enough tax to fund not even their day-to-day benefits from public sector, public service. They're not net contributors. Doesn't matter how brilliant a job they do, whatever they do, if you're not earning above, I think, about 45k, you're not a net contributor. It doesn't mean those jobs aren't worthwhile and more worthwhile than perhaps what all the three of us do.
They keep our civilization
well, exactly.
running.
They're the people who couldn't go into lockdown because we needed them.
Yeah.
But never, they certainly have not paid enough to cover. So when they say I've paid in, like my parents and everyone else's, and people listening who are at pension age, the reality is that money is coming from day-to-day taxes now. But we've got a lot of young people, and we've got a lot of people in the office in their 20s and 30s. I mean, they're not going to have those sort of pension benefits. They won't exist.
They've been absolutely sold a pup by the way that the welfare state has evolved over the years. House prices have been lifted way out of their reach, and I would argue partly because we've had chronic increases in the availability of debt. Look, if you create new money as debt, which is how it's done, and you pump that debt into house prices, of course house prices soar
and also
away.
You don't build enough houses and you import another 10 million people.
Yeah, but do you know what? if you price houses in gold, they're about the same price as they were in the 50s, incredibly.
It's extraordinary.
Yeah,
okay.
It's not something I want to bore you with today, but so we've got to start thinking really seriously, and people are bound to say I paid in, and politicians have got to rise to the challenge of saying, yeah, I know you paid in, but other politicians in another age spent that money on somebody else.
Sorry, but here we are where we are. Keir Starmer is not the man to do that.
No, he's going to be a disaster. Everything is going to be worse. His parliamentary party, having trained itself for 14 years to complain about every single spending cut. However, I mean, we were arguing that welfare reform was a moral cause from 2010, and they wouldn't have it. People like Rachel Reeves were using words like cruel. And having trained themselves now, it's biting Keir Starmer because he needs to do some welfare reform and he plainly can't do it. That government now has imploded. They're going to limp on for 4 years. They're going to make everything worse financially. And what I'm really engaged in here, I've got a project called Fighting for a Free Future with the think tanks. What I'm engaged in is trying to create a terrain of debate at the next election whereby we've got even a remote chance of being fair to particularly young people by confronting these problems in an honest way.
Again, I think honesty is absolutely the crucial thing, isn't it? Steve, I just did that, but just bringing Claire Pearsall. I mean, okay, you were both, a Conservative advisor. He was a Conservative minister. So I don't have too much agreement necessarily, but I've always said part of the issue is that voters insist on politicians lying to them and pretending that they can have, we'll do this, we'll spend money on that, we'll spend money on that, but don't worry, your taxes won't go up. Someone over there, and we've got that at the moment with Labour saying put wealth taxes up.
Yeah, we do. And unfortunately, I think the public aren't quite of the mindset that sometimes you need to make these really hard decisions and it's going to be painful for a short period of time, but actually in the future
it's going to be painful for a long period of time. The numbers don't add up anymore.
It depends what you're looking at, and it depends if you're looking at pensions, it depends if you're looking at childcare costs or whatever it is. Some people will have more pain than others, and life isn't fair.
Do we need to do a Blade Runner style thing? And I'm thinking, well, how old are my parents?
No, we do not.
Around 80, we just go, that's it, you've had your innings.
No, look, let's be honest. It is possible to return to growth. My friend Lord John Moynihan's written a book called The Return to Growth, and he's set out a very clear plan to do it. I wish I'd written the book. It doesn't
involve wealth taxes, that's for sure.
It does not. It involves cutting spending and taxes and going for growth.
There you are. Then John's saw him last night. He's going to be very, very happy with that mention on there. Big thank you to Steve Baker. Come back in the studio again, former Brexit Minister, former Conservative MP.